On December 12th of 2015, the body of an unknown man was discovered on Saddleworth Moor in northwest England. The medical examiner determined that the man had perished as a result of a lethal dose of strychnine, which is a highly dangerous alkaloid typically used in pesticides. The immediate theory was that the man had committed suicide. The authorities estimated that he was between 65 and 75 years old. He stood at almost 6 feet tall, had a thin build, and was balding with gray hair and brown eyes. The investigation that followed the discovery revealed that the man had been in Pakistan shortly before his death. He had a 10-centimeter titanium surgical plate attached to his left femur, which is only legal in Pakistan. He also had a container that had originally been used to carry a common medication called thyroxine. The label had text in both English and Urdu. The Pakistani authorities did not recognize the man, and his fingerprints did not match with any on record in either England or Pakistan. There was also no evidence linking him to any missing persons cases. The next step in the investigation was to piece together a timeline of events. At 9:04 a.m. on December 11th, John Doe used the London Underground train to travel from Elling Broadway Station to Euston Station in London, then to Manchester Piccadilly. Later that day, he asked the patrons in the Clarence pub in Greenfield about walking to Wimberry Stones, a picturesque tourist destination. He was seen later that day at around 3:59 p.m. by 2 members of staff for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, very close to the site of his eventual death. Intriguingly, the fact that John Doe had wanted to go to Wimberry Stones sparked a new theory in detectives. In 1949, an airplane had crashed in that area, and they believed that John Doe might actually have been one of the survivors of the crash, Stephen Evans. However, this theory was disproven when the BBC contacted Stephen, and he subsequently contacted the police, confirming that he was still alive. It would not be long before the real identity of the man on the moor would be discovered. In January of 2017, the authorities used photographs from a passenger list and images from CCTV footage in Heathrow Airport to identify John Doe as 67-year-old David Litton. The Greater Manchester Police confirmed his identity with DNA matching. David was described as a bit of a loner who liked his own company. He had lived in Streatham, South London from the 80s onward until he moved to Pakistan in 2006. His former neighbors reported that his main profession was a croupier, or someone who works at a gambling table, typically in a casino. He had also worked for the London Underground. When his career as a croupier fell through, David started renting out part of his home to make ends meet. One of his tenants appeared to be Pakistani. There's been speculation that this could be the reason for David's move to Pakistan, although it has never been confirmed. David arrived in Pakistan on October 6th of 2006, and he left for Dubai only 6 months later. After 4 days in Dubai, he returned to Lahore on March 31st of 2007. He left again in November, but there were no records of him ever returning. On February 4th of 2017, The Guardian reported that David's long-term girlfriend had helped him through bouts of depression. He also had a brother, but he had changed his surname after a falling out with his family. His former name had been David Lautenberg. His brother lived in North London, and his mother's family was of Jewish descent. They had emigrated from Poland to England in 1901 and had lived around East London. The Lautenberg family changed their name to Lawton in 1969. David's girlfriend, Maureen Toogood, provided many details about David's life in interviews for the BBC. She and David had met in 1968, shortly after he had left Leeds University, where he had studied psychology and sociology. He had never graduated. His last employment in London was as a train driver for the London Underground. After becoming a couple, David impregnated Maureen, but she had a miscarriage which David did not take very well. They separated shortly after, and Maureen got married to another man. Despite this, Maureen would visit David regularly and help out around the house. She stated that David was very interested in theology and he owned several copies of the Quran. In 2006, he sold his house without telling Maureen. He told his neighbors that he could not afford the mortgage anymore. When Maureen found out he had left, she suspected he had gone to the United States, but he had actually relocated to Hassan Town in Pakistan. He led a secluded life, but stayed in contact with his neighbors. He told them he had converted to Islam. When he returned to London in 2015, he was picked up from the airport by a friend who told the authorities that David just wanted to do some solo traveling. During his stay in Pakistan, David's visa had expired, but he attempted to leave the country anyway. This resulted in him getting blacklisted, but he eventually got a new visa. The new one was about to expire in 2015, meaning that his flight to London was a last-ditch attempt to leave Pakistan legally without having to reapply. As it turned out, the friend who had picked David up from Heathrow was a man named Salim Akhtar. They had previously traveled to Pakistan together on 3 separate occasions, and they were very close. Despite their relationship, David never mentioned Maureen to Salim, who found out about David's romantic life after his death. Patricia Ann Rose was 20 years old when she was reported missing from Sacramento, California in 1980. Patricia used the nickname Patty and had been married at the time of her disappearance. However, she had been estranged from her husband at the time. She was last known to be residing in a hotel with her 1-year-old son, who was found safe without his mother. Patricia was never seen alive again. In 1985, 2 hunters discovered a set of skeletal remains while they chased one of their runaway dogs. The hunters contacted the authorities, who confiscated the remains. Unfortunately, the skeleton was so old and badly decomposed that the cause of death could not be determined. The sheriff's office suspected foul play, but they could not substantiate their theory. For many years, DNA testing technology was not advanced enough to identify Patricia. She became known as the Applegate Jane Doe. The authorities knew that the skeleton had belonged to a female, and they created a facial reconstruction, which they released to the public. The case was also compared to statewide missing persons cases, but there were no matches. Project Justice eventually helped to fund the search for Patricia's identity, and Othram performed further work with her DNA to develop a profile. A family tree was created, which showed evidence that the Applegate Jane Doe might have had a living sibling. The Woodburn Police Department obtained a DNA sample from the sibling. This sibling had a sister who had gone missing in 1980, so the lead was very promising. The sibling's DNA matched Patricia's perfectly. The circumstances surrounding Patricia's death are still unknown, but law enforcement has stated that her death was suspicious. The investigation is ongoing. In September of 1974, 2 people were off-roading on a fire road when they came across a horrifying discovery: the dead body of a young man. They contacted the authorities and law enforcement confiscated the body. John Doe had been dead for somewhere between 3 and 5 days when he was found. At first, it was believed that the young man had perished as a result of accidental alcohol poisoning and diazepam overdose. However, a disturbing pattern was recognized by homicide investigators in 1980. Throughout Southern California, there had been numerous other deaths that had been caused by a combination of alcohol and diazepam. The new and incredibly creepy theory was that there was a serial killer on the loose. The cause of death being the same amongst the deaths pointed to a clear modus operandi. In 1983, a man named Randy Kraft was arrested during a traffic stop because a California Highway Patrol officer noticed something strange about the person in Randy's passenger seat. Randy's passenger was dead. The police also found a list in the trunk of Randy's car that had been written in code. They believed it was a list of his victims. It contained 67 entries. Kraft was convicted of murder and sodomy in May of 1989, and he was sentenced to death. The prosecutors stated that he was one of the worst serial killers in American history. Kraft is now 78 years old and remains on death row to this very day. Despite catching the killer, the authorities had still not been able to identify John Doe. His name and background would both remain a mystery for decades, but finally in October of 2023, Othram developed a DNA profile based on John Doe's tissue samples. They were able to connect him to a set of possible grandparents. These grandparents had a granddaughter who told law enforcement that she had not seen her 17-year-old brother since April of 1974. The woman gave the authorities a DNA sample to compare to John Doe, and it was a perfect match. John Doe was actually Michael Ray Schlicht, a former resident of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. According to his family, Michael loved warm weather and was known for hitchhiking. In a tragic twist of fate, this is most likely what led to his death. In August of 1992, a girl's body was found in a remote stretch of desert in Arizona. As the authorities would discover years later, the girl's body was only 40 miles away from her home. However, the case quickly went cold at the time due to a lack of evidence and would remain unsolved for decades. The case was entered into a database that was maintained by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Unidentified Persons System. Law enforcement believed the girl had been dead somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks. She had been wearing denim shorts, a shirt with soccer balls on the front and back, and a yellow ring on her left hand. The police found a public transit token in the front pocket of her pants that said, "Valid for 1 student fare." Interest in Jane Doe's case would rapidly fade as no new information could be found. It started to seem as if her identity might never come to light. In 2008, Apache Junction police investigator Stephanie Bourgeois took over the case and revived it, but the DNA testing she attempted to perform came back inconclusive. This was a major setback and would postpone any further examinations of the case for another decade. In 2018, Bourgeois hired the DNA Doe Project to develop a genetic profile of Jane Doe. The DNA Doe Project is a volunteer research organization that specializes in forensic genealogical analysis. The profile they created led the police to possible family members of Jane Doe. In a post on the organization's website, they stated it would take 5 years and countless hours of dedicated research by more than a dozen volunteer investigative genetic genealogists to find the critical breakthrough in this case. After finding the potential family members, the authorities collected DNA samples to compare to Jane Doe, and they were a perfect match. Jane Doe was actually Melody Harrison, who had been 15 years old at the time of her disappearance in June of 1992. Her family had reported her missing at the time, but they had removed her from the missing persons database in 1996 because they believed she was still alive and had started a new life for herself. This belief was the result of multiple reported sightings of a teenager matching Melody's description. Of course, as we know now, that teenager was not Melody. Despite having identified the Jane Doe, law enforcement had still not concluded anything about the circumstances surrounding her death. An extremely disturbing theory was posited, suggesting that Melody may have been the victim of a serial killer. In the years around Melody's disappearance, there were 2 serial killers operating in the Phoenix area. Their modus operandi both included kidnapping and murdering young women. The first was Scott Lair, who was eventually convicted of murdering 3 women, as well as attacking and raping several others. The second was Brian Patrick Miller, who was convicted in 2023 for the murders of 2 women. Miller is also suspected in the disappearances of at least 2 more females. The police have announced that they are planning to investigate this theory,